Hello, everybody. Welcome. And today we're going to be talking about a discussion on changing organizational culture to help improve traffic safety. All this is part of IT's effort to help organizations examine their traffic safety culture and to move toward the safe system approach. And today we're talking with Shelley Baldwin and Wade Alonso from the Washington Traffic Safety Commission about their recent experience examining their own internal safety culture and making some changes in how they approach traffic safety by adopting a traffic safety culture framed around the positive culture framework. Hello, Shelley and Wade. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to have a conversation with you.
I agree. Thank you.
So we have about 10 questions to get through, and we're hoping by going through these questions and just having you answer from your experience when you were looking at your safety culture and making a shift in how you approached your Vision Zero, that other traffic safety stakeholders can sort of learn from your experience and maybe emulate some of what you've done and anticipate some of the stumbling blocks you came across and learn from how you overcame those.
Okay.
So let's jump right in with question number one. How did Washington Traffic Safety Commission, which I will refer to as WTSC to avoid saying that long word every time, how did you operate before you began taking a more proactive traffic safety culture approach in your work with Vision Zero?
Thanks, Nick. So we weren't really aware of the positive culture framework before you had given NHTSA a webinar that we watched. And everything that you said in the webinar reflected on things that we'd felt were off for us, but we hadn't really been able to put our fingers on, nor had we, I guess, imagined what could be different. So we had some inklings. For example, we would run PSAs, and our partners at Department of Health and at that time it was DASA, Department of Substance Abuse Administration, would say to us, you know, when you do these things, like you talk to teens about not driving drunk, you're kind of making the norms all weird. You assume that they drive drunk when you're talking to them about not driving drunk, or you make them feel like it's a bigger problem among teens than it actually is, and you're kind of perpetuating bad stereotypes and not helping us with our goal of reducing drinking overall. And we would puzzle that and kind of try to figure out what that meant and how we might do it different, and really had a hard time coming up with it. We've been a Vision Zero state, or goal target zero, since 2000. So we already had a lot of vested interest in reaching zero and understanding that we needed to do that with lots of partners. So that's kind of where we were at. Not really being aware, not knowing how to make a change. When we listened to your webinar, we kind of went, oh, I think we want to know more about that. So the first chance that we had, I went down to Florida and had a class with Katie Dively and got introduced to the concept and loved it. And I think we had many conversations about not really being able to apply it to a statewide level and to traffic safety. Like, it was really kind of focused more on substance abuse prevention, which I appreciated, and community level pieces, which I appreciated a lot too, but I was having trouble really pulling it up. So in order for us to get kind of more comfortable with the whole positive culture framework, and for us to kind of address a pressing issue here, we really had to dive deep into it. And I think we'll get to that later as we talk about our work with the substance.
Good. You said a couple of words came up in what you were saying. You said you didn't really have any idea that things could be different initially. And one can imagine that when an organization's functioning with a certain set of processes and has a certain culture, that's the water you know. And it sometimes you don't know there's another way until you bump into the limitations of what you're doing, or you see an example of another way of doing it. Is that, but when you also said you had inklings or other ways of doing it. So that sounds like what you experienced. You were in a your own comfortable place of doing things, and it wasn't until you had other examples of how to do it that you realized something could be done differently.
I think that's a really great way to put it. It's that culture, fish in the fishbowl, swimming in the
Right.
water, not knowing what water is, but having these kind of, external forces say you're not doing it quite right. Um, and I think personally for me, I was working in communications, and we would come up with our problem statement. We'd go to a communications firm. We'd ask them to help us come up with a PSA. They'd come up with something. It was funny or it was whatever, really dramatic. And, I had no way to really, no criteria to judge that from, and no way of knowing if it was successful. So I
Hmm.
think that was the other nagging thing for me, was I just couldn't, it was just a blank. Like I knew we were supposed to be doing PSAs and letting people know about things, but I just wasn't sure if we were doing it in the most effective way.
You didn't have a framework to judge
Yeah.
other than actually evaluating the outcome, but walking into it, you had no criteria or framework to sort of help you decide what would be potentially a productive, effective approach.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I was just going to add was that from an operational standpoint, I came to the party a little late. Started with the agency in 2018, and one of the things I noticed was that I think due to the way we're funded, it creates a very cyclical nature to our work. And I was really interested to see that we really focused about 1 year at a time.
Right.
On this 1 year hamster wheel, I call it. So it's another symptom, I think, of the old way of doing things.
That's a good observation because that adopting a culture-based approach to improving traffic safety is a much longer time frame. It needs a more sort of proactive, long-term thinking cycle than what you would normally accomplish in this sort of 1 year program cycle. So it does force you to sort of be more proactive and think longer term, because shifts in culture takes longer than installing a new piece of infrastructure that would be a more traditional approach to it.
Right.
Just before we leave this question, I also wanted to, you're in your fishbowl, you're comfortable with what you're doing. Sometimes when you see there's another way of doing it, it can lead to a sense of intrigue. Ooh, that might be good. But it can also lead to either a sense of fear. I don't know what that is. That looks intimidating. Or it could lead to dismissal. That's not how we do it, and simply pass on it because you prefer to stick with the fishbowl metaphor, the fishbowl that you're in. So
Yeah.
what do you think it was that you were intrigued to look into it, as opposed to being afraid of trying another fishbowl, or just dismissed it because you were comfortable where you were? What do you think
I would say I
invoked
did
you?
all three of those,
Okay.
to be honest. Yeah, I don't think it's an either or, like let's charge ahead and I've got this. It was for me a complicated framework. And we hadn't actually come, we hadn't actually, you hadn't actually produced that proactive traffic safety book yet, right? It was still being formed, and the traffic safety culture framework is large and can be applied to anything.
Right.
I took a lot of hope in the way that we talk about frameworks being, a framework. It's not a Bible, it's not directions, it's
Right.
a lens that you can look through things in. And that took some of the fear out of it, because I knew that we were going to have to adapt the framework to work for us. But yeah, I was afraid. I was uncertain if it was going to work for us. And I was certainly later on, when we started working together and we looked at the Vision Zero components and did a pre-survey within work about our culture, I was really dismissive of some of it, because we've been working really hard on this concept that crashes are not accidents and they're preventable. And we've been working hard to change human behavior without really having a human behavior change framework to work from.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we started getting into some of the Vision Zero pieces around, humans make mistakes, it was hard for me to hear that because mistakes sound so much like accidents, and we've spent decades trying to convince everyone that these aren't accidents. So we had a couple of conversations where I'm really pushing back on it, saying, "Oh, that's not how we think here."
Right.
But I've since come to really appreciate that is how we should be thinking here, and we've made some strides to embrace those thoughts in different ways. So yeah, I did all three. I was intrigued, I was afraid, and I was certainly dismissive of parts of it while I got my head wrapped around things.
Wade, how did you feel when you came across it?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context at the time. For me, it all starts in 2018, and that was the year that NHTSA, our funding agency, introduced GMSS, the digital grant. Well, I guess it was a digital portal for our highway safety plan to be submitted to them. And they changed some of the rules. And one of the things they changed was that we are really good at giving them a list of projects every year. And our whole, I would say that call for proposals that generated that project list really drove everything. I think it contributes to the one year time frame cycle. But starting in 2019, they said that they wanted to know a lot more about the strategic justification for the strategies we were choosing and the planned activities. So they want to know a lot more about the strategic framework behind what we were choosing to fund or recommending for funding, and a lot less about project detail. And so that happened. Shelley, with all her work with you and on the culture framework, really, I think feel like it had teed us up at that point to think about something other, and then NHTSA was kind of forcing us to think differently.
Right.
Also, I was new, and I was doing a lot of interviewing with my new program managers and asking them, new to me, asking them like what they thought, and I was hearing from them like they're really hungry for evaluation other than crashes, some other way to evaluate their work other than just based on crash numbers. They're really hungry for that, and also hearing some of them saying like, we think about this call for proposals that drives all our work, and we did a little study and found that like 70% of the projects we were funding through the call were funded every year. And so we weren't turning up anything really new. We were. That's not true. We were finding innovative techniques and projects for sure. But I guess there was I think among the PMs, there was at least a few that were hungry to find maybe an alternative way to do some of this work. So
interesting. So some of it's serendipity then, that there was a change to requiring more of a strategic framework for why you were doing projects. And the traffic safety culture itself lends itself to a strategic framework for how you go about doing the work. And you can also measure changes in culture, which also ties on to that other aspect about how do you evaluate the success in the efforts you're making toward traffic safety.
At the time, yeah. At the time, I was researching like how other states were going about doing strategic planning, and I ran across like Pennsylvania had spent a bunch of had worked with their children's hospital, and they basically had taught them a version had basically contract with them to learn a version of what I would call the public health approach to planning, which is looking at data, implementing, learning, evaluating, changing, and then re-implementing, that kind of model. And in 2018 or 19, we had contracted with Montana State to provide training to us on the positive culture framework. And I think we were coming at it at the time from like how we might implement it at a project level. But I was doing this research on how we could adopt a different strategic planning model. And at a break, I walked up to Jay Otto in the middle. I said, "The world changed today. This is the model we need to adopt for planning, for our program planning." So for me, that was kind of a big, that was a kind of a shift in my brain that day.
The epiphany.
Yeah. Exactly.
We're talking a lot about the positive culture framework and the proactive traffic safety culture approach. Some of the audience will not have heard those terms before, although when we provide this video link, we'll also provide some links to give them background on those two concepts. But in short, the positive culture framework is a recommended process for measuring and shifting the shared beliefs, the shared culture around a particular behavior, in this case, a traffic safety related behavior, such as wearing a seatbelt or driving distracted or driving after using impairing drugs and so forth. A traffic safety culture approach, the proactive traffic safety culture approach, it's called proactive for a couple of reasons. One is it sort of looks in advance as to what the existing culture might produce, anticipate the kind of culture we would want to get the behavior we want, but it very much focuses on the positive aspects of the community culture, the strengths in the community culture. One being that most people don't engage in the risky behavior, and to celebrate that and leverage that as a way of helping those who are being risky to engage in the safer behavior itself. So it's very much different than the more traditional scaring people into being safe, and it's more aligned with the idea of how do we make people belong to the same community and want everybody in their community to all be safe. But we'll invite you, if you haven't yet looked at those links, to go back and look at those shared links so you have an understanding about what Shelley and Wade are talking about with their experience at the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. Let's move on a bit now. You've alluded to a bit, but before the change, your attention toward thinking more about this shift to a more cultural-based lens on doing your work, was there a particular event that motivated your change in thinking? Was it something not working with what you were doing, or an idea you heard? What was sort of the trigger where you began to think, could we be doing things differently?
Yeah, for me, it was really as I started to explore the framework and think about how things were going for us, and the information I felt like I was missing. Like, it's hard to take a project, you know, we receive funding, it comes from a specific stream of funding, it's to do a specific thing, and we run that project for a year. And then at the end of that project, there's not a really good linear translation between that investment in whatever it was that we were doing and a reduction in deaths. And, you know, the classic question that Jay Otto always asks is, are you busy or are you effective? And that evaluative thinking, putting that evaluation at the beginning of, you know, your equation really changes how you think about what you want to be doing, right? Instead of just spending money and checking the box, you really want to be able to point to how you're being effective. And I think that it was that that was very alluring to me, to be able to kind of think, you know, I could, from the communications, I could actually look and purposely try to change behavior and measure that through attitudes and beliefs, as opposed to a reduction in crashes. You know, here's year one and end of year one, we're going to have a reduction in crashes, which is so unrealistic. But if we start to change that underlying assumptions around culture, you know, attitudes and beliefs, willingness, all of that equaling a change in behavior, then I have waypoints to start hitting along the way. And that that was, for me, I was all in at that point.
You can measure your progress in the process to reducing crashes.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Shelley, you said that, because that question, are you being busy or effective? That is probably the most important question I've been asked in the last four years. And I think that question resonated with everybody, because I'm going back to that training we had at South Puget Sound Community College, and Jay asked that question in the group, and that was part of the presentation, and that resonated with everybody. Everybody was thinking the same thing, from the director at the time, Darren Grondell, down. We were all asking that question. That's really important, I think.
And the observation behind that question, are you busy or are you effective? You know, are we doing things that we've always done and that's why we're doing it? Are we measuring whether it has an effect or not? A lot of things we do we don't always evaluate the outcome, so we don't have evidence that it's effective. We're just staying busy with what we've always done. And by looking at the way shared beliefs influence behavior, how culture influences behavior, we can not only measure the shared beliefs and the change in behavior, which gives you measures of effectiveness.
Yeah.
It also helps you create a logic why something should be effective. What beliefs are you trying to change? Do we know it affects behavior? If so, we should expect to see a change in our outcomes. So it up front gives you a logic to work with so that you can hope some rationality is in part of what you're trying to achieve in your strategy. You said you had an inkling something was missing. So if you never came across the concept of traffic safety culture or the positive culture framework, do you feel you would have had this nagging sensation you're not where you want to be?
Yeah, definitely.
And how did that sensation come by? I'm wondering if there are, you know, colleagues in other organizations where they sort of have this sort of feeling something's not quite complete or not quite where they should be. How would they recognize that, and how would they act on that?
That's such a good question. Um, you know,
Because it's
I
easier
think,
not to, right? It's
right.
easier just to go with it.
And I think that sometimes we're very, it's very easy for us to not really challenge ourselves that way. It's easier to go along and just do what you've always done. But that nagging sense that we could be doing it better, there's other things out there that we're not exposing ourselves to. I think it really does drive your approach to being open to finding it. Does that make sense? I'm a big believer in the fact that we find what we're looking for. So if you've got that nagging feeling that it's not quite right, I think it behooves you to go ahead and pay attention to that feeling and know that as you pay more attention to that feeling, answers are going to manifest. That sounds a little woo-woo, but your brain works that way, right? If you're looking for something, you're going to notice it more than if it hasn't been part of your thinking before.
Yeah, I completely agree. We work with Jay Otto all the time. We have for over a year now, and I meet with him every week. We talk about the progress we're making and how we're doing. And he said something similar, Shelley. He said, if we have the courage to ask tough questions, then we create the space for the answers to appear.
Oh, good.
So
I feel much better about myself now.
again, we come at this from an operational standpoint, and I was looking around at like what others were doing, like who were the most successful groups at doing this kind of work, and what were they doing? And it looks to me like substance abuse prevention people who we have really close relationships with in Washington have a very strong framework they work with. And if we hadn't come across positive culture, probably would have been trying to adapt their model to what we were doing. But again, Montana State and the Traffic Institute was so convenient. I mean, everything was in one package, so it's just amazing.
You know, when we adopt a Vision Zero, which is an ambitious goal, would you agree that there's almost inevitability of feeling uncomfortable with the way you're doing things when you have set such an ambitious goal? Is there a need almost to have this sort of sense that you need to do more, that you're not comfortable with the status quo and how you're doing it in order to get to that ambitious goal of zero?
Yeah, so like I said, Traffic Safety Commission adopted that Target Zero goal in 2000 after looking at the Swedish model and how they were thinking about things. And we set it out 30 years. So in 2000, we said by 2030. And in 2000, that sounded like, you know, we'd have jet planes flying from our residences by that point. You know, I mean, 30 years, that's so much time. And now 30 years is approaching. So I think that the understanding that events weren't going to just overtake us and make zero possible but that we had to consciously
Right.
pursue zero as is our responsibility as people who make the rules, and not that Traffic Safety Commission builds roads, but we are all responsible for the culture of our roads and how we behave and how we drive. And
Right.
you know, we can't sit back and anticipate, you know, automated vehicles are going to solve all our problems, because that's
Right.
way too far away. And 2030 is right around the corner now. You know, there's a
Right.
lot of pressure around that.
And you both mentioned a couple times looking at what other people were doing, specifically people outside your building, outside your silo. You know, from working with us, we're always learning to get to these ambitious targets. We have to learn and see things differently. What was it about your existing culture which naturally led you to look outside your silos?
Traffic Safety Commission has always been nationally super lucky when I look at other highway safety offices specifically, in that by law, we're an independent small agency run by a commission. And all of the other state agencies that have an influence on traffic safety are members of our commission. And partnership comes super natural and easy to us. And, you know, back in 2020 and certainly by, you know, 2007, we understood that an agency of 25 people is not going to be able to overcome the nearly 600 this year traffic fatalities that are occurring on our roadways by ourselves. That it's always going to be about partnership. And so that aspect of our culture, that celebration of partnerships, of finding ways to bring people together. I think one of our superpowers is convening, and that's always been there. I think that led itself really nicely to embracing a positive culture framework. And
Which aligns very much with the safe system approach, right?
Right.
It's all about different stakeholders, not just doing more of their own thing louder,
right.
but actually cooperating together, aligning their efforts, finding synergies and working together. And example of the commission is almost an existing mini safe system, as are those states that have some form of Vision Zero coalition. They have the, you know, the beginnings of a safe system approach, which they can leverage and work with. And I agree, once you're already in that sort of model, sort of a cooperative partnership model of stakeholders, it's probably more natural to sort of see and think about the way others are doing things and what you can learn from that.
I think also our values. This is one of the few agencies where I think I could ask anybody in the agency and they can tell you what our values are.
Right.
And one of our values is there's two values that come to mind: innovation and learning. That I think we take seriously, and I think that was part of making the ground fertile for these seeds to grow. We're innovation focused, and also I think we have partners that also feel that way. When I think about one of our close partners, Washington State Department of Transportation, their secretary, Secretary Millar, is a very innovative guy and forward thinking. I think he's also helped some of this momentum go forward. So there's a lot of things I think that were made us ready for the change. There's lots of things going on at the same time. Shelley's curiosity around this and leadership, bringing us along, I think has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned values. I mean, values are part of any organization's culture. It's the values of the communities you serve as well. And we've spoken before about, before you start thinking about strategies to change the culture amongst road users, traffic safety stakeholders should also reflect on their own agency culture to see how well it supports the culture-based approach specifically, but more broadly, how well their culture aligns with the Vision Zero goal itself. And I was struck when we first began working with the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, innovation and learning are not only stated values, they're obviously demonstrated in how you work on the projects you work with. You may recall, Shelley, one of the first things we helped the commission do was to measure the organization's culture in terms of its how well it aligned with its own stated visions. Did staff feel they could be innovative? Could they take risks? Because getting to zero requires innovation. If we could do more of what we already knew how to do, we would have been at zero by now. And a lot of the solutions to get to zero don't exist yet because we haven't got to that point to think of the ideas or had the partnership where those ideas were possible. So your statement about understanding your own values and how those values sort of naturally led you to examining and changing your culture and learning from that experience, I think is a good example of why organizations should reflect on their own culture. Are they ready to move in a different direction before just storming forward trying to do it? Because if you're not ready, you're not going to be as successful, which will be frustrating.
And I would say, if you're not ready, you're still going to learn as you proceed, and
Right.
you will become more ready. I think Wade has been really responsible for organizationalizing kind of this concept of we're going to go down this road, and Wade's been able to kind of really put it into logic models that program managers are building around their programs and around the strategies that we're working, and we're incorporating culture into those nitty-gritty pieces of everything we're doing. So I wouldn't say when we concluded our organizational assessment that I looked at that and went, oh yeah, we're all right there.
No, that's good, true.
I think that since then, I mean, it's been a few years now, we are closer to being there than we were at the end of the first assessment.
That's a good point. Knowing where you are is better than not knowing where you are. Yeah. And getting more ready is part of the process.
I like I love the work of Patrick Lencioni as far as organizational management goes, and one of the things he talks about is that firms that are more successful don't wait till they have perfect information. They execute, pivot. And that's exactly what Shelley's saying, is that you learn a lot moving forward, even if it's imperfect. You learn a lot. And if you're able to learn and change, then you can constantly do that. So,
right. And as you know, the whole process, the positive culture framework, it's not one loop and you're done. We're always in a process of evaluating and learning and getting better at what we're doing. And that actually is quite freeing when you know that you're always learning. You don't always have to be right because you've got a chance to learn from it and do better next time. So
that's a good point. I emphasize that to program managers a lot. I say the pressure's not on executing, the pressure's on learning. Right. You don't have to be perfect. As long as we learn and we can change, that's the important part.
That's well said, because that kind of culture does allow for innovation.
You're right. You're right. And as we've learned more about innovation, we've studied innovation actually in our agency. I think one of the things that's helped our values stick is that we have a values minute at our staff meetings where we kind of keep these things in front of us. And there was a presentation on innovation, and it said things that lead to innovation is a culture that is friendly to innovation. Right. And so it's a part of it.
From new ideas.
That's
is key. So how would you describe the way you work now that you are not finished with your change in culture, but are well along the process, beginning to implement actions that represent this change in culture and evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies based on this new way of thinking? How would you describe this emerging culture that you are moving toward?
I'll start with some overarching pieces, and then this is where Wade really can give concrete, here's what we did, examples that are very, you can grasp it. It's not just urethral. From my point of view, I think that, we've embraced the positive culture approach. And one of the best things about that has been that recognizing, I think prior to this, we thought of our customer as an unwilling customer, as a young man who embraces risky driving behaviors and isn't going to listen to us no matter what we say, and doesn't appreciate the things that we try to do to keep the roads safe. I mean, that's a very limiting customer. You're just kind of like, well, how am I supposed to do anything then?
Right.
To a customer who is the majority of the population in Washington, being able to conduct the surveys that show us, how few people actually drive after drinking, and how many people actually intervene to prevent a drunk driving trip. I think those pieces of information have been worldview altering for us, so that we're now talking more to the people who are more likely to hear what we have to say and are more likely to take that proactive step next once they've been made aware of it. So an example from this weekend is we've been running some Facebook ads, and we've run lots of Facebook ads. This one, I think we're doing some testing, A/B testing on, and it was about our upcoming DUI prevention campaigns. And it was really about, it was a woman who had her arms up, can't see me, like this, but behind her was kind of like the superhero arms coming up around her. And the message was kind of about, most people in Washington say something, do something to intervene if someone's going to drive impaired. What are your stories? And we've run lots and lots of Facebook ads. And prior to this, our ads were focused largely on upcoming enforcement campaigns, and the fact that extra police would be out. And the comments, they were directed directly to young men, and the comments were what you'd expect, right? not super positive or thoughtful comments. In this weekend, I kept seeing these hits from our Facebook ad with really deep, thoughtful questions and stories. People talking about, when my mom was drinking, we tried to make her stop and we couldn't, so we finally would remove the battery from her car and prevent her. And she was so mad at us, but she's still here. I mean, the kind of depth of a Facebook post that you just don't usually see kept coming up in these stories and these questions, and legitimate conversation about, well, I don't want to fight someone to stop them from driving, which is a great point to make. No, we don't want you to do that either. So the approach is just giving us this engagement at a deeper level with people who do care about the safety of our roads, and helping them to see their role, what they can do, and not just, it's hopeless, we can't stop this thing.
So that's an excellent example of what we're doing, that the Together We Get There campaign. I'm not aware of any other campaign that was purpose built to be positive traffic safety culture message from the ground up. It was intended to be that way. It was audience tested, and it's been a positive campaign from the very beginning. I'm not aware of any other agency or state that's doing that. So
there's a couple, but yeah, it's that I would say that one of the biggest changes, one of the most visible, easy to look at changes, has been this communications change in how we message and how we talk to our partners and how we talk to the public. And it's earth shaking for me to really embrace, a proactive traffic safety message. We all have a responsibility. We all can be doing something different to improve the situation that we're in. And the Together We Get There campaign really was born of our understanding of the positive culture framework and the proactive traffic safety approach. So it is a baby, and we are nurturing it.
So just to provide some contrast, if you take that example, how would your old approach compare to that?
Oh, I have a really great example, because we ask people. So when we were testing the Together We Get There campaign approach, we ask our focus groups to think about traditional traffic safety messages that they could remember. And we gave them a feeling wheel all full of different emotions. And we asked them to think of that commercial and then tell us how that PSA made them feel. And they were we didn't know what they were thinking of necessarily, so they were kind of all over the map, but mostly grounded in fear and anger emotions, which we know aren't the best places to be to ask somebody to learn something.
Right.
That's you know, they're going to reject, or they're going to fight it, or they're going to just
Right.
ignore it. And when we showed them our concept and asked them how that made them feel, the emotion wheel was like flipped on the other side. It was joy, it was surprise. So I have a very good grasp of the difference and the place that we put people when we talk to them this way, as opposed to talking to them about horrible, very, you know, it happens, people die and it's horrible, and we keep that in our hearts all the time. It's not that we ignore that, but
Right.
we're asking for a partnership with people that's different than shaking our finger at them and telling them all the things we don't want them to do. We're helping them see the things we want them to do. And that's a whole different communication space.
That was a great example, because you know, the culture-based approach is very much about wanting to work with people rather than chastising the dangerous people. And the example you gave, it focuses on the positive. There's still concern about the issue, but the fact is most people don't do the behavior. So you're focusing on the positive, and by having a positive energy around the message, you're using a positive emotion, people are drawn to the message versus the more traditional fear-based or very demanding ones where people react and avoid. So that's a fundamental difference between the traditional approach and the traffic safety culture approach. And the other part of the example of the Facebook campaign was you're also engaging the audience in an activity, which in essence creates conversations. And conversations are one of the ways that we begin to examine, reflect, and change what we believe. If we don't have conversations, it's hard to shift culture. And by having a positive message, one that's hopeful and inviting, you have people engage in the conversation. So it's a two-pronged attack compared to the more traditional scaring people into being safe, but not thinking. You're actually having people approach a topic with concern and interest and having a conversation about it, and hopefully forming the kinds of beliefs that will reduce that behavior going forward. That's a great example.
And I think I really think, after thinking about this a lot, that conversation is one of the prongs, the basic prongs that we have to make space for. And not just with audiences across Washington, but with our own staff.
Right.
That the more conversations we have around this concept and how we're implementing it, the more focused and thoughtful we become in our approach. And I think that's where Wade's can really demonstrate some of the differences between when we did call for proposals and we tried to slot them into our funding sources versus what we're doing now.
Yeah, so yeah, operationally since 2019, we've adopted program plans as for every one of our priority program areas. So there's a program plan for distraction and distracted driving and impaired driving and tribal traffic safety, etc. And the program plan was always designed to be a logical progression of data, focused population strategy, and then outcome. And one of the things that I guess the positive culture framework really helped us reinforce was that. So now going forward, all of our all the countermeasures that we are recommending in our highway safety plan have a theory of change that is created for them. That's meant to very clearly surface our assumptions. And we have to essentially say out loud how we think this countermeasure is going to influence behavior of the focus population. And if we do influence their skills, knowledge, and beliefs, how that will change their behavior and how that behavior change could have impact on crashes, and then how that can have an impact on serious injury and fatal crashes. So again, it's a really a logical progression. But to get there, we really had to step back and agree on language first. That's one of the things. First things we had to do was create a glossary, honestly, of words. In some places, sometimes we had to reconcile 4 different definitions. So, but that was really a key piece. We've created a process improvement committee to recognize what we need to change in our processes and embed those in our grant management system, our digital grant management system, to make this all work. And that's been ongoing. It's been a great thing. Our WEMS team's amazing. And then every one of the projects that we fund through grant, those scopes of work are based on a logic model that flows from that theory of change. So now our scopes of work, our grants, I think have never, I don't know if they've ever been better. They seem very strong to me, because there's the scope of work flows directly from that theory of change all the way down to the measures. And we have new words for measures. Where we used to say performance measures, now we say process measures, outcome measures, and impact measures. So it's expanded the way we think about evaluation. So yeah, we've laid that groundwork to start helping us, learn and pivot. So
interesting. You've mentioned the importance of conversation a few times, and the example of the Facebook impaired driving was conversations amongst road users. But as you alluded to as well, the organizations responsible for traffic safety have to have their own conversations to move the way they think forward as well. To what extent was there conversation within the Washington Traffic Safety Commission during all this, and how did you cultivate conversation in a constructive, forward-moving way?
I would say one of the first examples of that was really bringing you in to help us talk about driving under the influence of alcohol and cannabis. Kind of this alarming combining substance use that we saw in fatality crashes, and trying to understand what was going on. Why were we seeing this increase in combined substances? And really, we came together every month, and we thought about things. You led us through conversations. And I think that modeling of here's how we can really address a situation to understand it better, the time commitment that it takes to really explore it, the modeling of how to use a survey to get your answers, and then how to embrace the survey's answers to set your next steps. I think that modeling of conversation, because that's what we did. I mean, we sat around for a couple hours every month, and just talked. You were great at modeling that conversation. And I think it's really helpful to have someone that you can trust, that can help you feel the water in the other fishbowl, and guide that conversation. Additionally, as part of that project, we really looked at kind of how to ask the questions, how to have these kinds of meaningful conversations and support our work. And the biggest aha takeaway, I think, for all of us was really, it's not about getting that person to agree with you.
Right.
That's not the standard, that you take a conversation, that you take a conversation to hopefully get somebody to think a little bit about something differently.
Right.
Even if they reject it, you've ultimately had a victory, because if they're rejecting it, they're also thinking about it.
Right.
Rather than just ignoring it. And that's been groundbreaking for us. I think that's a new measure for us.
Excellent. I'm go off script a bit and ask a question. Because we've been talking about conversations about traffic safety culture. You've talked about how you've been using it. Some people, when they are talking about plans to work with this concept or not, can push back sometimes because they feel it's too ambiguous or too fluffy or too nebulous a concept. I'm curious if you felt that and how you overcame it, and what would you say to someone now who had that initial reaction to it?
I would say, let me get Shelley. I think you're right. One of the things I like about the culture framework is that it is frameworkable, and so it is quantifiable, and you can get your arms around it. I'm a student of that. I think that Shelley's really mastered the ability of talking about it with our partners, or she's a senior and I'm a freshman. Say like that.
We're all learning from where we're at.
Go ahead.
I think that amazingly enough, I think we received less pushback than I would have expected. Culture, because, for example, DOT's already interested in culture. Certainly our law enforcement partners are interested in culture. It's a word that is being used a lot. So when I think about whether this is nebulous or whether this is concrete, I think that it was more nebulous before we started employing the concepts that we can actually measure.
Right.
You know, to me, it's much less nebulous than here's the money, go do this program, and everything's going to be better. It gives us an actual template to look at to say, are we making a difference in this attitude? Are we expanding people's skills in being able to do this thing? You know, are we connecting with people's values? And being able to measure all of that is a completely different world than, you know, if we're working on seatbelts, it's fine because we can do an observational survey. So we can do an experiment. We can go look before and we can look after and see if more people are buckled up. Right? It's pretty concrete. But if we're talking about impaired driving, that's really nebulous. It's really hard to measure.
Right.
And yet when we apply a culture base to it, there are specific things that we know will impact their decisions that we can actually measure. So for me, it's much less nebulous than before.
Right, because you intentionally measured it.
Right.
No, I agree with both of you. You know, when you talk about traffic safety culture at the very high hand waving level, yes, it's nebulous because there's lots of different ways to define traffic safety culture. And in fact, if you ask 10 people what they think it is, you'll probably get maybe 10 different answers to what they think culture is. But once you get down to working with the concept, it becomes the opposite of squishy because there's steps you go through, there's tools to measure it, there's ways to analyze the data. It becomes a workable metric like many of the others that we traditionally work with in traffic safety engineering.
Yeah.
One of the things I
So
see
it's almost being, sorry, Wade?
I was just going to say that with the national conversation we've on law enforcement over the last 2 years, or I guess going on 2 years, for me, it's like I've had this thought like over and over again that this is the time is right for traffic safety culture when it comes, especially to our law enforcement partners. That this is again, it's a positive approach. It's gonna yeah, I'm really excited about where we're going with our law enforcement partners in traffic culture. We are going to be exploring that over the next year. New strategies that law enforcement agencies can implement. And one of the things I've learned is that I think any agency that has a community policing philosophy should embrace positive culture because it's just it's a strategy that works hand in glove with that approach, that philosophy.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the word pushback, Shelley, and that you got less pushback than you thought. My next question was, what were some of the initial barriers and challenges you encountered when you were making this shift and while you continue to make this shift? And how did you overcome those barriers and challenges? Were there some primary ones that come to mind? And how did you manage to either dodge them or overcome them?
I have to give a big shout out to Darren Grondell, who was our director at the time when I was doing this exploring, in that he allowed me to explore. He allowed me to bring training to the agency. He supported the concept. He was working with the Montana Pooled Fund, exploring culture. He took time to learn about it as well. And so within the agency, my path was not encumbered. I had a lot of co-conspirators and a lot of support from executives, and that made it great. And at the same time, I think the concepts around safe system approach were really, we have at our Washington State Department of Transportation, a safe system expert who's been, you know, thinking about this, thinking about where we are as a state with Target Zero, and thinking about what the safe system approach could mean, as we are merging these two concepts now. And so they were really ready to talk about culture. They were very excited about it. And like Wade said, I think law enforcement agencies are very interested in culture and how that can help. If people were resistant, it didn't come to me. And I think that when part of it was because I probably speak with such conviction, people are afraid to tell me I'm wrong. Maybe it's also because as we've worked in it, we have our regional boots on the ground called Target Zero managers. And, they may have come at it originally with a little bit of, this is woo woo, but I think they're really committed now. They've been doing monthly exercises, projects to help them understand better how to employ traffic safety culture, proactive traffic safety culture around a myriad of traffic safety issues. They've been producing their own messaging out to the community using the framework as their basis. And I think they've come to really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're right. We've also given them training on the theories of change model, how to do strategic planning using that. I was surprised that we didn't get, one of the things we had to do to adopt this model was give ourselves some room and time to learn these tools. And so that meant we had to take a year off from doing, or 2 years off from doing the call for proposals, which we've been doing for years and years. And I was really surprised at the lack of outcry that caused.
That's interesting. So it sounds like a combination of leadership support and local expertise, but also going through a process of learning and taking the time to learn, where it wasn't a shock factor as much as it would if, you sent an email on Friday afternoon saying, starting Monday morning, we're now adopting this new approach.
Yeah.
Do you think this sort of the conditions that sort of are enabling you to move forward with this approach, a culture-based approach, is it seeming to be successful because there's something unique about the commission, or was it something about the process that could be applied anywhere that would lead to success?
My perspective, I have to agree with Shelley, Darren Grandel, and he said challenge the status quo, and then he supported that when we were starting to come to him with ideas. So I just wanted to just say that. The other thing was that there was a lot of things going right, or that allowed this to happen. The leadership, NHTSA support, a lot of things that were our values. A lot of things I think were set us up for success. Our relationship with Montana State.
You're going to add anything, Shelley?
I was just going to say, I think that although we had a lot of really wonderful support mechanisms in place for it, I think anybody who's interested in assessing their impact can find a way into this way of thinking that'll benefit them.
By using culture as an interim step, changes in culture as part of the process.
Yeah, I think anybody could find it. So yes, and yes, we had great support here, and the opportunity to learn. So certainly just being able to have the interactions we've had with the Center for Health and Safety Culture have been amazing. The other state that's really employing this approach is Idaho, and the first class I took with Katie Divey, their at that point brand new director for their office was also in the class, and they developed their shift campaign. They did it before we did. I mean, and it's really about changing the conversation, which is such a great approach too. So there's some combination out there of availability, willingness to kind of take a look and dip your toe in the water. And then because it's a framework, you can't do it really wrong. So there's just a little bit of forgiveness in our attempt to embrace it.
Right.
We're also small. It makes us, I think, a little more nimble than maybe larger a bureaucracy. We're pretty nimble.
I was going to ask, would you say did you encounter, or could you imagine a different agency could encounter one particular roadblock? Is there something sort of structural about being a traffic safety stakeholder that would potentially be a barrier to moving forward this approach, or a barrier to change in general?
I can say something real quick while Shelley's thinking. I think that a barrier could be how agencies or how society has defined success for agencies or practitioners in this. If we are rewarding a busyness, if we're rewarding following a process that's established, and we're doing it very, very well, that could dissuade this kind of innovation. Because why would you, if you're being successful in by every measure that you've been given, then why would you ever change?
Yeah. Although traffic fatals have certainly been going the wrong direction, not just in Washington, but across the nation. And you can certainly see that in other countries, it's not the same situation. So
Right.
within the US, it seems to me that everybody should be asking their question about what's next. What do we need to try and embrace next time? Because we need to make a change.
Are we being busy or effective?
Yeah, I would think.
And I think that's where the three concepts that are being talked about a lot most recently, Vision Zero, the safe system approach, and traffic safety culture, how they all connect.
Yes, exactly.
Because the Vision Zero, the boldness of that vision requires you to think outside of your comfort zone, to think of new innovative solutions. And the safe system approach is one of those strategic approaches to traffic safety, which requires a shift in how we think and cooperate and work together. So Vision Zero needs a shift in traffic safety culture to embolden us to make the efforts to get there. And at the same time, we need a culture that sort of aligns itself with this desire for partnership, for learning, and for working together.
I think
So
if
it just seems
anyone
like
were to really I think if anyone were to really think about what a barrier might be that hasn't gone through this process, they might say, we don't have the time or we don't have the money.
right.
And as far as money goes, this has not been expensive. It's been about training. It's been about time spent in conversation. It's been
There's some
about,
investment.
yeah, it's been about making an investment, but it's not, we haven't had to spend $1 million on it.
Right.
It's been very, very manageable. And we've kind of set aside money to explore this, every year a little bit. And every year we get a little more training and we have a little more conversations and we have more time to think about how we can make these changes. So money-wise, I think any highway safety office could probably find the resources to do this. Time-wise, like Wade said, we had to make a conscious decision to change our process enough to give us time to make this change. And that was a commitment that we made.
Have you found that by engaging in this process, in particular focusing on sort of evaluative thinking, are you busy or are you effective, you've actually found more time by getting rid of things that turned out to be not terribly effective?
Well, I think Wade made a really good point when he said we had traditionally done call for proposals. When we stopped saying we're going to do this call for general proposals, we want time to think about what kind of proposals we really need to pursue. We didn't get a lot of pushback. Part of that was because 70% of our grant funding was going kind of to the same thing every year. And so we said, look, you guys, you don't have to apply for it. We're just going to negotiate the contract. And the other 30% that, didn't get a lot of attention in the meantime was also things that we may not have pursued given this framework. So
Right.
Now that we have a framework in place, we can pursue a much more specific type of project that is in line with what we're trying to do. And I think it sets us up for better success down the road. So yeah, it was kind of giving up all of the time and energy we were spending on assessing everybody else's desire for money, and just saying, here's what we know, we're going to fund anyway. We know that this works. They're great partners. We don't have problems with it. It's recommended strategies or whatever. And now I think we're in a better position to use that other funding. And honestly, as we look at the new transportation authorization, highway safety offices are going to have more money. And that puts us, I mean, I feel like the timing on that is great because we're now in a position where I think we know how to spend that money more effectively, what types of things we might be looking for to really change these basic levers of culture than we would have been had we not gone down this pathway.
Excellent. Where would you say you are? Just a few more questions left. We're on a roll, so let's keep going. Where would you say you are on your journey of change, and what do you think the next big step might be for you?
I think that we're still beginners, and I hope that we always come to it with a beginner mind of knowing that we don't know everything. And I think our next big piece is really going to be looking at how this new authorization is going to open up opportunities for us in ways that really do align with where we've been going. For example, with law enforcement dollars, the new authorization will require that we have a community component when we're spending law enforcement money. And that's exactly the conversations we've been having with our law enforcement partners already. So I feel like we're ripe to really embrace these pieces. We just presented at Washington has the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. It's unique. Most states have a sheriff's organization and police chiefs organizations, but these guys meet twice a year together. They have a traffic safety subcommittee, and our work with the law enforcement officers on culture prior to that allowed them to vote on a resolution to support a program in schools that we're just getting off the ground. And that was a first. We've never had that happen where we've had that kind of support. And really they came up with the idea, we're starting to implement it, and they're supporting it. And it's not about enforcement. It's really about education in high schools and culture change and behavior change that can be measured. So we're excited.
What would you say some of the biggest benefits are for your organization? Oh, sorry, Wade, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had a couple more things to add to that. One is where we are in the process. We are in the process of launching our first annual statewide survey. That's going to give us the first time we'll be able to have a broad across Washington look at skills, knowledge, belief, and behaviors around all aspects of traffic safety, road safety. So our intention is to do that annually. This is totally an outgrowth of this culture work. The other thing we're working on is, we've got a lot of the pieces in place. Now we're looking at, okay, we got the car on the road. Now we're driving it now we're starting to drive it down the road. And so we're going to be looking at, okay, we're gathering the right kind of information. Now we got to build our culture around evaluation. We got to build in the time to pause and say, what did we learn and how are we changing based on that? I think there's a couple of big things that we are working on. Some things I think about is, again, the way we organize, we're funded around program areas, right? But it makes me challenge some of the assumptions of how we based our planning in silos, and think about including in our planning, thinking around organizing around the cultural ecology. For example, strategies around the family, strategies around workplaces, strategies around schools. So it's kind of where we're at.
It's great to hear you're taking a measurement of traffic safety culture as one of your annual performance metrics, for lack of a better word, because it does let you look at that as a shift in process that would hopefully lead to changes not only in behaviors, which you're measuring, but also in your crash and their outcomes as well. And we know in terms of conversations changing culture, talking about this data provides a natural subject for conversation and the directions it's going in and so forth. Last couple of questions. How would you say this shift has benefited the Washington Traffic Safety Commission in terms of its people and the work your people do? How has this shift benefited you internally?
I would say, first of all, it was really, really difficult. It's been hard. I think it's something to understand is that doing this kind of thinking, adopting this kind of thinking is difficult. It's a skill. So there's time, it needs to take time for that. But it was difficult to implement this too in 2020 when we were in the middle of a pandemic and distributed. And some of this happened in the lowest morale point of probably the work world in the last 20 years. So that made it hard. But all of that makes it incredibly gratifying when you hear a program manager say, I feel like I've got new tools now to think about this, or I've always wondered about how we're really going to be evaluating our work. This is the first time I really can see a path forward for that. So that's super gratifying to hear. I also say what it makes, again, a lot of our work and my role is around operations around grants, and our grants are very, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that one, but by using this process and changing the sort of the cultural emphasis, you're getting better quality projects.
I think so. Again, because they're tied back to a theory of change and a logical theory of change. It really clearly states how a strategy is meant to influence a population's skills,
Right.
knowledge, beliefs, and then hopefully behavior.
Do you want to add to that, Shelley, or are you happy with Wade's answer?
I think that's a pretty good answer.
Let me flip it. What would Washingtonians, your end users, the people you serve out on the roads, what would they say? How have they benefited from the change in the organization that serves them?
Thank you for that. I think that's a question that we want to be measuring. So I hate to speak for them, but I do think, knowing what I know now, that we're not traumatizing them further by showing them horrible car crash scenes. We're not excluding groups by making fun of them or making them the villain. And I think that those concepts are really important to me. We're not triggering anybody else's addiction by showing alcohol or drugs or drinking in our PSAs. There's just a lot of things that moving away from our traditional approaches, where we most outreach to people, doing it in a kinder fashion that encourages them to have a conversation, that doesn't belittle them in doing it. That there's just a bigger awareness of equity. There's a bigger awareness of, that our role is not necessarily to point at someone and tell them they're doing it wrong, but our role is to have that conversation and developing ways to do that in ways that'll help people listen. I think that, that's my point of view. That's what we're trying to give them is something where they can actually join us and feel good about it rather than feeling like we're judging them. And I'm looking forward to the survey, so maybe we can hear more about how that might be impacting them, but I don't want to presuppose their thoughts.
No, that's an important part of this cultural approach, is that we don't assume what someone's beliefs or culture is. We give the courtesy and the scientific validity of actually measuring what it is directly.
Asking, yeah.
My closing question for you both is, what is your vision of success for this approach 10 years from now, when you've moved from being beginners to being intermediate experts in processes for changing culture? What is your sort of vision or hope or goal for what you as an individual and the Washington Traffic Safety Commission as an organization looks and operates like under this umbrella, cultural-based umbrella 10 years from now?
It's a big question, Wade.
I agree.
I think we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about that as we kind of relook at our strategic agency approach this year. And so hopefully by that point, I'll have some better conversations with you. But just in my imagining, I would like more people to see how they're connecting to our roadways. I would like to have more people embracing a sense of shared responsibility for our roadways and for safety. Ultimately, the goal of proactive traffic safety is to move people from compliance, which most people are doing right now, really understanding that most people do comply with our laws, to that commitment to safety, to really having an individual, a business, a family, having these conversations, promoting safety in the best ways that they can with these conversations at that very fundamental level, those levels across what we call the social ecology that are reaching that person who perhaps right now is making more risky decisions. And the culture will have shifted enough that that person doesn't see those decisions that they might have been making now as acceptable anymore. And can see ways in which they can make that change themselves. I think that's the kind of the broad piece. I think within the agency, really being able to embrace and move forward, understanding the framework, within the framework, embracing the framework, knowing that we're beginners and we're going to make mistakes, and being brave about doing that anyway. And hopefully, ultimately, I would like to see us have a statewide survey that we can come back to and start to see some shifts in attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, I agree. I would go out on a limb. I think the culture is here to stay. The culture approach is here to stay. I don't think I think we'll still be working on this in almost 2032. By then, I think we'll look back and not remember a time when we weren't working with a cultural-based approach, in fact. But I think what we're going to be doing is, I'll take a shot in the dark here, that I think we're going to be more focused on bigger, longer-term multi-agency strategies, specifically around like shared protective factors. And I think about something like sort of emerging right now around emotional intelligence. And I wonder, because emotional intelligence can be so positive for so many aspects of life, not just traffic, but safety. But I think it's something that we're going to end up working with substance abuse prevention and Department of Health, injury and violence prevention, and educators. I think it's something that a lot of different agencies are going to coalesce around. That's my prediction. But again, it's a positive cultural approach, and I think that's something we'll end up working on. Things like that, and I think we'll be focused more around like parts of the ecology, right? More around the school, like the school as a mechanism or a vehicle to influence behavior through cultural channels.
No, I agree. I think sort of we began talking about traffic safety culture a couple of years ago, and now we're talking about the safe system approach, which entails stakeholders working together. And one can imagine these two working together as we move forward, so that it's most traffic safety culture efforts then become a collaborative effort amongst traffic safety stakeholders. I agree with you completely. That's what I would hope to imagine too. And Shelley, you mentioned, aside from shifting culture around specific behaviors, doing so in a way where people, in addition, grow this sense of shared responsibility for traffic safety on the roads, not just for themselves, but for others, because this shared responsibility part is at the heart of the safe system approach.
Yeah.
Road users have to have their part of the responsibility to operate within the system in terms of how it's designed to operate. So I think that's a nice, a necessary outcome of the culture-based approach is not only to address the culture around particular risky behaviors, but also to grow this larger sense of shared community, shared responsibility
Ownership,
for
yeah.
everybody's safety.
Yeah, well
It's
put.
also interesting.
I completely agree with that.
I also like what you said, Wade, about some point you'd sort of forget when you began working with traffic safety culture. You know, culture by itself, we're not aware of it unless we're changing it. And at some point, when it is fully our culture, we won't notice it anymore, which is kind of a strange thing to think about. We're so aware of it right now because it's a new approach we have, and we're questioning our own culture and so forth. So at some point, it becomes natural because it is de facto our new culture. Well, Wade and Shelley, I want to thank you for almost an hour and a half of conversation without fading away. That was quite impressive. I appreciate that very much. Again, I want to thank the audience for participating in today's video, and please look at the links that come along with this video to get some background information off the website about the proactive traffic safety culture approach and the positive culture framework. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Shelley and Wade would be happy to answer those. Or you can contact me through the university, through Montana State University.